Today, we're going to talk about inflation. Because here's the thing. I think this word, in the way it's typically used, might quietly be the most misunderstood idea in all of economics. That misunderstanding is not an accident. It's a fog that has been very convenient for the people who built the current monetary system. So when most people say inflation, they mean prices went up, right? The cost of groceries went up, rent went up, gas went up. That's how the word is most often used. And that's what the mainstream financial press means every single time they use it, whether that's on air or in print. But prices going up is just the symptom of inflation. That's all it is. Inflation itself is the underlying disease. The real definition of inflation is the expansion of the money supply. That is to say, inflation is the act of creating money and credit. As the new money then enters the system, prices gradually rise to account for it. So what we're talking about here is the difference between cause and effect. Inflation is the cause. Prices going up, that's the effect. Okay, with that said, things are about to get interesting. We talked 2 weeks ago about Kevin Warsh, the new Federal Reserve Chairman. In assessing his background and his early actions, we came to the conclusion that Warsh is not a Keynesian and that he appears to be serious about shaking things up at the Fed. We also noted that Warsh said explicitly that inflation is a choice, and he stood up several task forces to assess the Fed's operations and to challenge the orthodoxy. The most interesting task force is the one set up to analyze productivity, jobs, and the impact of artificial intelligence, or AI. For that one, Warsh appointed a prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalist named Marc Andreessen to spearhead it. So for those who know anything about Andreessen, this is telling. If we look at it a little more deeply, I think we might be able to project exactly where this is going, and it further suggests that Warsh understands the true nature of inflation. Hello and welcome back to the Phoenician League podcast. I'm your host, Joe Withrow. If you've been with me the last couple weeks, you know we've been following something of a continuous story here. 3 weeks ago, we talked about Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent reviving Alexander Hamilton's American system on the fiscal side of the equation. Then 2 weeks ago, we talked about the new Fed Chairman, Kevin Warsh, and how he doesn't really fit the standard Keynesian mold that's really dominated academia in this country for the past 50 years or so. And then last week, we followed the money trail all the way down into how capital in America got financialized, how it stopped building factories, in Detroit. It started bidding up the price of my old starter home in Charlotte, North Carolina instead. So today is the next chapter in that same story. And I have what I think is an interesting read for you today. For decades now, the Federal Reserve has run largely on the same internal orthodoxy. The people sitting on the board all went to the same schools, they learned the same models, they read the same books, and they largely, I think, held a similar worldview. It's been something of an intellectual monoculture for a long time now. But Kevin Warsh just named the people who are going to lead his 5 task forces to assess the Fed's operations, and there are quite a few outsiders on the list. Now, there are some Keynesians mixed in there too, so we're just going to have to wait and see how it shakes out. But by far the most interesting guy that Warsh is bringing in is Marc Andreessen. This is the guy who co-founded the Netscape internet browser back in the 1990s. And for those of us who were there watching the birth of the internet, Netscape was mind-blowing. We don't think much of our browsers today, but it was a radical innovation at the time. Man, I still remember the little Netscape symbol, in the top corner of the browser. And I remember that pervasive feeling that all the world's secret knowledge was about to be at my fingertips. That was the great promise with the rise of the information age. Okay, so Andreessen cashed out big when AOL, America Online, acquired Netscape for about $4.2 billion. And I believe that was late 1998. So the guy was still, I believe he was in his 20s still at the time. So he kind of did the Silicon Valley thing, and he founded a few other companies with his seed capital. And then in 2009, Andreessen founded his famous venture capital firm, VC firm, Andreessen Horowitz. And that's alongside his partner, Ben Horowitz, his business partner. So he'd worked with Ben, I think, on a couple of his other startups. So the VC firm is often referred to in the industry as A16Z. Their firm went on to back startups like Airbnb, Coinbase, GitHub, and there's many others. They've been very successful and they're highly respected in Silicon Valley. And more recently, Andreessen has been vocal about espousing the techno-optimist philosophy. In fact, he wrote the manifesto for it. So if you haven't heard this term before, techno-optimism is the belief that technological progress is the primary force driving human flourishing, abundance, and really that technology is the solutions, can bring the solutions to all our biggest problems. And so in his 2023 Techno-Optimist manifesto, Andreessen argued that we've been fed a steady diet of fear-mongering and pessimism about technology. And we've all been spoon-fed warnings that it was going to destroy jobs, it was going to harm the environment, and, generally just make our lives worse. So he rejects that view outright. And Andreessen makes the case that technology, powered by markets and unrestrained innovation, will create a virtuous cycle. He makes the case better tools will lead to more intelligence, will lead to cheaper energy, to greater productivity, and really to the material abundance that lifts the standard of living for everybody. So core to the philosophy is the idea that societies must either grow or stagnate. That constant forward momentum through science, through engineering and entrepreneurship is essential. And so Andreessen sees AI and other emerging technologies as accelerators that can help us solve mankind's top challenges and ultimately create a world of even greater abundance. Now, I'm not myself a techno-optimist because to me, it really comes down to, well, who controls the technology? And, Andreessen strikes me as a decent enough guy, but I just don't trust Google or any of the big tech companies with this stuff. So, I'm a little bit on the fence there. I'm a little bit skeptical from that perspective, but still, I can appreciate the vision. If we get it right, and if the advanced technology is used for good rather than ill, then it is a beautiful vision, aspects of it anyway. But that's a discussion for another day. For our purposes today, I want to point out how Andreessen's view and his inclusion on this task force dovetails with our discussion on inflation. So at the top of the show, we agreed that inflation is the expansion of the money supply and that rising prices are just a symptom of inflation. Prices go up because you have more money bidding for the same amount of goods and services. And I'm oversimplifying here, but that's the gist of it. So if we agree to this definition of inflation, then countering a broad-based rise in prices is really simple, right? Just stop expanding the money supply. And of course, there are plenty of nuances in here, but the big picture is straightforward. If prices go up because you create more money, well, stop creating money if you don't want prices to go up. Pretty basic. But that's not the Keynesian view. Their view is that inflation is caused when the economy overheats. and their solution is to deliberately try to slow economic growth by raising interest rates and tightening fiscal policy, really to tone down inflation when it arises. Now, I find it hard to believe that people actually believe that stuff. At some level, I suspect they know that it's all bunk. That idea that the economy is just this machine with pulleys and levers, and if you just get it right, you can take care of everything. They at some level, they've got to understand that's not how it works. But regardless, that's the view they've preached in university economics classrooms for 50 plus years now. Now, here's where Marc Andreessen comes in. As we alluded to, prices are actually the product of really two forces. On one side, you've got the money supply. How many dollars are in circulation? On the other side, you've got the supply of real goods and services. How much actual stuff is the economy producing that people want to buy? So if the money supply grows faster than the supply of real goods and services, then prices are going to rise. But if you can make the economy produce more stuff, right, then theoretically you can expand the money supply and prices might not rise very much at all, because they would just keep up with the supply of goods and services. So that's the techno-optimist view, right? The techno-optimist view is that if we can have the breakthroughs we need in energy to make it cheap and abundant, and if we can have, robots equipped with advanced AI that are cranking out all the basic goods and services that people want at very low cost, then theoretically our cost of living would go down dramatically. So Elon Musk has voiced a similar belief in that worldview recently. And he went on to suggest that there's, somewhere around $1.5 trillion of outright fraud embedded in the U.S. government's fiscal budget every year. Not just the stupid spending that's wasteful. He's saying $1.5 trillion just blatant fraud. So to Musk, the answer is to eliminate that fraud, which would largely eliminate the fiscal deficit. Not entirely, but close. And that would dramatically curtail the expansion of the money supply. And if that happened at the same time as the economy began to pump out more goods and services, well, you would theoretically see prices come down. So don't get me wrong here. I'm not 100% convinced that it would happen this way, but I do understand the argument, and I think it's an interesting one. So as we noted a couple weeks back, Warsh has already rejected the Phillips curve. As a reminder, the core idea underlying the Phillips curve is that there's this trade-off. It says if you let the economy run too hot, and if unemployment gets too low, then prices have to rise. And so to keep prices in check, you have to deliberately slow down the economy. Something like that. That's the Keynesian medicine. And that's the model that's really run the Fed for 50 years now. And so Warsh has said in public that he thinks it's bunk. So now that he's bringing in Andreessen, we can deduce that he's embracing something of a techno-optimist approach, or at least he's willing to listen to its assessment. And if that's the case, I would not be surprised if Warsh actually cut the Fed's target interest rate much sooner than the market expects. That would make the president happy, and it would explain why President Trump was willing to appoint a Fed chairman who's known for having a hawkish bent. So it looks to me like both Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on the fiscal side and Kevin Warsh here on the monetary side are going to do whatever they can to enable a technology-driven productivity boom. It certainly looks like that's their goal. Of course, that doesn't mean we are going to see an end to structural inflation. Not at all. Structural inflation is how they deal with the massive federal debt level, Instead, it looks like they're going to do everything they can to try to grow the economy. And they're going to hope that productivity in the economy outstrips the monetary inflation that's associated with running fiscal deficits and all this debt. And so they're hoping to offset, the consumer price increases that we would normally see in that case, right? And so that's my read here. Anyway, I don't think it's the ideal solution, but it is much better than stagflation. We'd rather the economy grow and try to offset inflation rather than having a stagnant economy and inflation. And so I think this is something to keep an eye on. Can these guys thread the needle, though? That's what they're trying to do here. So we'll see. So let's talk about the investment implications to all this. If this read is correct, and if the game plan is to go for broke on AI-driven productivity here in America, then somebody has to build the physical backbone for it, right? That would mean more power plants. That would mean more energy generation, more transmission lines, more transformers, really more infrastructure all over, right? And that means there will be outsized demand for industrial metals like copper and silver. And there will be outsized demand for natural gas and for uranium for nuclear power. And there's also a case to be made for things like steel and concrete too, though you'll lose people's attention fast if you talk about those things as investment opportunities. But from an investment standpoint, you want to own the scarce, physical, real things that a tech-driven boom would need to run. And so, guys, I've said this plenty of times before, but I'm very confident in saying the age of paper wealth is over. I've been saying that I think for 4 years now. So the bottom line is, if we want to position our investments for this new economic era that we're entering into, it's all about actual production. And that means it's all about real assets. So I'll leave you with this today. Always remember that language is important. Words are important. The words people use and the context within which they use them can sometimes tell you everything that you need to know. So for 50 years now, the establishment has used words in such a way as to distract people from what was really going on under the hood of the economy. Their language around inflation is a big part of that, among all kinds of other things. So let's make sure that we are clear on exactly what words mean. And if we are, we can recognize when they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes, and then maybe we can see what's really going on. And that's what we strive to do here at the Phoenician League. We do this kind of deep dive analysis because I believe very strongly in something that Dr. Gary North used to say. He'd say it quite a lot. Let me make sure I get this right. He would say, if you know what's happening, you'll know what to do. I think that was Dr. North. Anyway, it's been quite a while now. But that saying has stuck with me. So if this kind of approach to investment analysis interests you, I'd like to invite you to our next public-facing strategy session, which will be tomorrow, July 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can get all the information at PhoenicianLeague.com/session. SESSION, or just get on our email list at PhoenicianLeague.com and we'll send you all the details. All right, that's it for me today. See you at our session tomorrow night. That's going to do it for today's episode of the Phoenician League. If you found any value in today's conversation, please subscribe to stay plugged into the network. We put out new episodes every week. And if something we talked about today made you think differently about money or investing, please leave a review and let us know. That helps the show reach the people who could really benefit from it. And remember, financial freedom does not start with money. It starts with understanding and a fiercely independent mindset. So if you would like to dive deeper into the topics we cover, I invite you to get on the Phoenician League email distribution list at PhoenicianLeague.com. We often send out detailed written analysis on the various investment opportunities and the asset classes that we advocate, and we connect the dots across what's actually happening in the global economy. And then we host online strategy sessions periodically as well, where we can really drill into how to take full command of your financial future. So stay connected at PhoenicianLeague.com. And until next time, let's stay smart and let's stay independent. This is Joe Withrow, signing out.